Welcome everybody to another episode of Spartan Theology. I got a super exciting video for us today. I got Dr. Douglas Campbell on to talk about Pistis Christou debate, and I've really been enjoying a lot of his work, and I definitely recommend checking out his books. I'll have a few of them linked in the description below. He's got a lot of books that are really, really good. I recently have been listening to Paul and Apostle's Journey, and that one, like, I didn't know exactly what I was getting into, and I was like very surprised. Like, I enjoyed it even more than I thought I would. So yeah, I definitely recommend checking that one out. And then if you're really ambitious, or you can check out his giant book Deliverance of God, which I haven't yet. But then he's got, Pauline Dogmatics seems to be kind of like the in between, which is like the not ridiculously long and crazy book, but really, really good. Yeah, I've read a little bit of that one, but haven't gotten as far as I'd like to. But yeah, and you can also see I got John with Apocalypse here, who, if you've been watching my channel for any amount of time, you know John. But yeah,
I've been
before we
on too
kind
many
of
times.
yeah, yeah, before we get started too much into like exactly what we're going to be talking about, if you could just kind of give a brief introduction of yourself, Dr. Campbell. I know you teach at Duke, but yeah, just kind of give people just a little bit who haven't ever heard of you before, maybe just a little introduction to who you are and kind of why you're interested in this debate, if you don't mind.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. So I'm actually originally from New Zealand, and I've been an academic, and not for a much shorter time than I've been a Christian. I was a convert when I was 20 in New Zealand, and I ended up going off to grad school doing religious studies in Canada, taught for 7 years in Dunedin in New Zealand in my alma mater, and then I taught for 7 years in London at King's College, moving more and more steadily into Paul. And then I got an opening at Duke, and so I've been here at Duke since 2003, and I've basically stayed working on Paul, and I also work on prisons and mass incarceration. That's the other string in my bow, but they're surprisingly closely related when you get into it. And what drives me in a lot of this is, I have a tremendous passion for the Christian gospel and what it is and the truth about it. And when we grasp it, what a fantastic tool it is to help us to understand what it is we're involved with, what sort of God we're involved with, and what sort of God has gotten involved with us actively, and what the church should look like. It's a very, very dynamic, liberating, exciting thing to be a Jesus follower, and it really is important that we think about that as rigorously and deeply and accurately as we can. So I love theology. I love talking about truth questions. I love talking about the related questions that really matter, questions of politics and ethics. But my other passion is that I believe that Paul's version of the gospel is widely misunderstood by the church, very, very widely misunderstood and blocked and excluded. This is a source of great frustration. And yeah, one of the places where you can drive a wedge into this false understanding, maybe crack it open a bit, is what we're going to talk about today, which is
Exactly. Yeah, like as I've gotten introduced to your work, and like really through John is where I got introduced to kind of like academic theology. And it's fun, and I get really into the weeds, but sometimes it gets a little, draining, or I just don't feel like it anymore. But through your work, it's really been like you even mentioned right at the beginning, like the gospel is the heart of all this. And really, like, I feel that when I read your stuff, and like you and Chris Tilling and a few of these other guys I've gotten introduced to, Jeff McSwain, like I've got introduced to through John, that are related to you guys. And that's what keeps me going, and I really appreciate that. And that's kind of why I want to introduce people on my channel to your work. And like you said, this debate is kind of like a good place to really get in there a little bit and use the academic side of theology to really show what Paul's gospel really means. And I really appreciate that. So
right, exactly.
Yeah. So, and John, I don't know if you want to say a few things before we get started. Maybe not necessarily like introduce yourself, but just kind of like what are you doing here? If you- but no, I think you're
Then
muted.
mute myself first. Yeah,
Yeah,
what am
but
I doing here?
yeah,
Um, yeah, I mean, part of it is uh, I obviously don't know as much of it, about this debate as Douglas does. He's been working on this for quite a long time. Shockingly enough, I think the first paper you published on it, I was 4 years old, maybe, when that happened. So it's been not to make you feel old, Doug,
When were
but
you born?
90.
Man,
I
I
think
think you would have been 2 years old.
really 92 was the yeah.
that's the
Well,
year I was born. How about that?
yeah. So sorry, Doug.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, the other thing is I'm also interested in the debate because I, like Douglas said, it really gets at the heart of sort of what Paul is all about. If we get it right, we're going to get. I think we're going to get Paul right. The other thing is Doug and I are currently working on a book together that does include some of this stuff in it. It's sort of like a little. It's sort of like his big book, Deliverance of God in a Can, in some ways. Although it does touch on some other things. So I'm here kind of as the Doug's co-author to be, and I'll comment when I feel like I have something to say. So
Yeah, no. Yeah, you're the first person I ever like even knew this was a debate was through you.
right.
So, and like you obviously are good friends with Douglas. So yeah, so obviously glad for you to be here too. I half the time I joke around and people on my channel probably think I'm like a jerk to you, but too bad that I'm
Oh, to
not.
me.
Yeah, yeah. But I guess if we could get started here, if you could kind of just Douglas just introduce us to like what is this debate? This Pistis Christou? Why is it a debated topic? Where has it been? Where kind of has it started? I know, yeah, there's a lot of kind of going into it. Not necessarily exactly where it started, but I think there's like kind of from my reading, there's like a modern invigoration or whatever of this debate with like Richard Hayes and stuff like that. So if you could kind of introduce people like where are we at? What are we talking about? You know, kind of what just big picture, what's going on here?
Yeah, sure. It's pretty simple. There's data in Paul's Greek, about half a dozen places, depending on how you count them, where you've got what's called a genitive construction usually with Christ or Jesus Christ. And the genitive construction is the way Greek is telling you what the relationship is between Jesus and the word that precedes him in the text. And the word that precedes him is pistis, which in Greek is usually translated as faith or faithfulness or trust or believing or something like that. And so the question legitimately arises, what is this genitive case trying to tell you? What is Paul trying to tell you when he uses this case? Because you can construe these cases in lots and lots of different ways depending on the context. And theological agendas will roll in here very, very quickly, and they should. And if you're reading Paul in this manner that I think is actually slightly problematic, but if you're, say, for example, reading Paul like a modern person, and you're not very self-conscious about what modern ideas you're bringing to the text, you might not be aware that you're reading the text very individualistically. You might not be aware that you're reading it with a bias towards thinking as against acting and emotions and other things. You're probably going to read this and say, well, you know, Paul's like me. He thinks that what really matters in life is me and what I do and my individual choices and decisions. You know, it's a really American way, in a way, isn't it, to read the text. So you're going to say this is faith in Christ. And you're going to construe this genitive. There's different ways of technically construing it. Basically, Jesus is going to be out there or maybe defining the content of your faith. But the faith is yours. It's your thinking, your doing. But this is probably not how Paul was thinking, because he's an ancient person. He's not a modern citizen of a liberal democracy. He's not a child of the Enlightenment. There's another option here, which shouldn't worry us. And I think it speaks volumes when it does. But the other option is this is Jesus's own fidelity. And Jesus's own fidelity is part of the story that Paul tells about Jesus, which is how God has acted to save the cosmos through the obedience, the suffering, the death, the burial, the resurrection, and the ascension of his Son. So what this would do, if this reading was correct, this would be a subjective reading of the genitive. Jesus would be the subject of the faith. It would be his faith. He's the subject acting through his own faithfulness. So that's a very different focus and set of concerns to be bringing into the text at this moment. So in these half dozen places in Paul, which are very important places, all of a sudden we've got to talk more about Jesus and less about ourselves. And this is a big challenge to folks that want to make the gospel about you and me and what we do. But this is a great thing for people like Ethan and I and John and Laura, the team, Chris Tilling, the people that want to make the gospel about what God is doing for us through Christ and not so much about us. We're a bunch of sort of dilapidated Bardian Calvinists, and we don't have very much confidence in humanity and what we bring to the table. We're much more excited about what God brings to the table and us getting involved with that. Does that make sense?
Totally, yeah. And for myself, like, I became a Christian in like a pretty evangelical, but it was very Reformed Calvinist. And since like learning more, I've kind of stuck in that tradition, but you know, a little more critical and like seeing these things. And this like hearing this idea, like your idea here, to me makes total sense. I mean,
yeah,
like,
Reformed guys get it.
Yeah, and it's weird that it's weird for me that Reformed people push back on this. Is kind of the last thing. Yeah, just that seems strange to me. But
exactly, you're exactly right. Reformed folks, when I talk to them, part of them just totally gets it straight away, because you've got this wonderful emphasis on the high priesthood of Christ, and Calvin's so keen on the high priesthood of Christ and so keen on election, which can be developed in an unhealthy way, but can be developed in a very kind and compassionate way where God is initiating, and the gospel is about what God is doing to reach you, and not and then summoning you to respond to that. But the first word is about God. Yeah, you wanted to slip in there, John?
I mean, it's interesting that with sort of Reformed folks who have a real emphasis on the priority of God's grace, you know, that's when they talk about faith and human faith, right? It is sort of God's gracious initiative, at which point it's like, why not just go with the subjective genitive that's giving you all that you need? You don't need to sort of maintain the sort of anthropocentric stuff. It just seems a bit odd when that happens, but
yeah, and it seems to me like so if to think of faith as a gift, if you take kind of the objective, right, is the opposite view. I read this so much, right. I'm confused on myself. But yeah, if you take the objective view, it's almost like faith is like the gift of faith is God giving you like a superpower. You know, like all of a sudden I can do something I couldn't do before. When if you read it in the subjective way, it's like God's literally giving you something, Christ's faith. It seems to make a lot more sense to me instead of give me a superpower, you know, because I think at least that's sort of how I kind of see this, if that makes sense.
No, that's you're enfolded in that narrative of you know,
it seems a lot easier to give me something he has as opposed to give me something I do. You know, that doesn't seem like as much of it doesn't seem make as much sense as a gift. But yeah, so I think maybe the next place we want to go, what I wanted to kind of touch on, and I know you mentioned this right at the start, is it's kind of this debate is a very like technical, grammatical, syntactical kind of thing, but it's also, like you mentioned, relies on your fuller understanding of Paul's gospel and what Paul's understanding of, you know, ancient times and things like that. So could you kind of touch on like how much do you see this debate as like a technical, grammatical? Do you think you could prove one side or the other simply by looking at the grammar and whatnot, or like you said, can you talk a little bit about why we should be thinking about this more of a big picture theological kind of debate?
Yeah. I do think you can prove it. And I don't think you have to get too technical. But when people don't like a reading, then they get really technical, kick up a lot of dust. That's kind of what happens. You do always need to be aware of the big theological pressures, because these are always swirling around and influencing the sorts of judgments that you're making that are really close. And sometimes you do have to drill in, but one of the key texts is Romans 3:22. Rolls off the back of Romans 3:21. Righteousness of God has been revealed apart from Torah, but attested to by the Torah and the prophets. The righteousness of God has been revealed through, and then we get faith of Christ for all those who have faith. And you go, first of all, you go, well, it'd be a little bit odd. It's a little bit repetitive if Paul is thinking this is just your faith. It's all about your faith. So the righteousness of God has been revealed through your faith in Jesus Christ for everybody who has faith in Jesus Christ. It's like, yeah, we got it the first time, Paul. But maybe he's just, being wordy. More importantly, when you think about this, the righteousness of God is probably a very dramatic, inbreaking, powerful act by the divine king. God is the king acting to save us. The righteousness of God has been revealed or made visible. Now, hold on a minute there. Your faith does not make the righteousness of God visible to the cosmos. It responds with a truth affirmation once it has been made visible. But it doesn't actually make it visible. That is massively overestimating the importance. It's just confused, actually. But the Christ event, where Jesus is faithful, buried, and resurrected, that reveals the inbreaking of God definitively, which is kind of what Paul seems to be saying once you notice it. So exegetically and grammatically, I've made this argument for some time. And I had not come across good objections to this reading, and I've not come across a good solution from anybody else to that text. I don't think you can get around the fact Paul is saying that this dramatic saving act of God has been revealed, and it needs to be revealed through the resurrection. And again, Ethan, who's going to have a problem with that? Who's reformed? I mean, you're going to sit down and go, this dude is saying that God's saving act has been revealed through Jesus' resurrection and ascension. What could possibly be wrong with that?
Yeah, exactly. I actually was looking up some of the other side a little bit, and they touched exactly on this point, and they try to make the point, like they say, the repetition problem isn't as big a problem as it first appears, and they're talking exactly like Romans 3:21 and 22. And they're saying that Paul probably intends to place the emphasis on the all in 3:22. That is, God's righteousness through trust in Jesus Christ to all who trust. And it seems to me exactly like what you just said. It's still just a repetition. I don't really. And then they try and say it's like an oral culture, and that's like a common technique for but it's still, it may be an oral culture, but it is still a letter that he's writing, right? Like, it's not a audio recording of what he said. So I think, you make a good point there. I don't see how this really gets around that whole repetition thing, which is extremely important, and really, like you said, it wouldn't make much sense to just repeat yourself.
Well, and there's a problem with the object too. Paul doesn't actually often, apart from in the disputed places, locate Jesus as the object of faith. The object of faith, 99% of the time in Paul, if not more, is the Father.
Yeah.
God the Father. And all the way through Romans, it's God the Father. And Abraham believes in God the Father. So if you're reading Romans carefully, the object that you're going to supply whenever you mention someone believing is God the Father. That's where we're taken to by Paul's gospel, which is not, I'm not saying we don't believe in Jesus, obviously we do, and Paul did, but there's slightly different roles here. So yeah, again, I think context starts to line up against the objectivists. they start to slide into what we call special pleading in these situations. Yeah, is that how you read it, John?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think another pretty decisive text comes out of Galatians 3:15-21, where you have the sort of revelatory nature of Christ's faith there. You have this sort of chain of motifs that show up that have to do with arrival and coming. You have a seed, which is singular, that has to be talking about Jesus there. That all sort of connects together once you get to 3:22 there, which is the genitive in question. Is that going to break that chain of singularity and arrival and revelation if it's about you, right? Or is this actually going to be talking about Jesus's faithfulness there? He's the one who's been promised beforehand, as the text says. This also is in the context of another Abraham discussion, like Doug was talking about, with the object of Abraham's faith being God. It seems like an objective reading would really sort of fracture that really clear, singular, revelatory account that's going on in Galatians 3. So I think that's a really important text as well. And I think it's really hard to read it another way successfully.
I mean, it's really difficult because because Paul says the seed is promised, the seed is coming, exactly. The seed is Christ. Yeah. And then you get in about 5 verses, faith is promised, faith comes.
Yeah. So faith is linked with that. It's that singular.
Join the dots, bro.
Yep.
And that's join them. Tell me why you're not.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think the issue is because you have the genitive comes up again, prior to that into especially 2:15-21, which is another key text. So people make up their minds, it seems like, at that point. So if someone's an objective reader, they're already going to be reading this, right? Yeah. Objectively.
Damn it, I'll make it work.
Yeah, and so once you get to 3, it's like, well, I have to do something with this.
I mean, they're in trouble. They're in trouble from the get-go because you've got 2:15-16. I mean, I'm happy to say, off the top, this is ambiguous.
Of course,
I don't think it is, but let's just say it's ambiguous. But as soon as you get to 2:20, you have I have been co-crucified with Christ. The life I now live, I live by means of, and then you go, faith in the Son of God who loved me and delivered himself for me, or by means of the faithfulness unto death of the Son of God who loved me and delivered himself for me. Well, given what he just said, I have been co-crucified with Christ. I live by means of the crucified Christ. Right. That's kind of what you would expect. That's what the grammar suggests. Ethan, that's another place where some of the technicalities are helpful. There's much discussion of articles. We've got the Greek article. We've got definite and indefinite articles in English, us something, the faith, the faith, all this kind of stuff. Greek's a little looser than that, but here it throws in a couple of articles. And ordinarily, unless you've got pretty strong evidence or reasons to the contrary, 2 articles bolting together 2 other things are saying they belong in a very tight relationship of identity with one another. So the faith of the Son of God is trying to tell you it's his faith. In all the other texts, we don't have articles doing quite such strong work. But the reason for that's often overlooked is in those other texts, Paul is quoting or echoing Habakkuk 2:4. Very important scriptural text for him. The righteous one, through faith, will live. And so part of this whole discussion would be a suggestion by folk like John and me that that's a messianic prophecy. The righteous one is Jesus. It's one of his titles in the New Testament, probably derived ultimately from Isaiah 53. The righteous one, through his faithfulness unto death, will live. He'll be resurrected. Very precious prophetic text for Paul because it predicts his gospel, his account of what Jesus is doing. So that's why there's no article in all the places where Paul refers to, because there's no article in Habakkuk 2:4. The righteous one through faith will live. But when he's not echoing Habakkuk 2:4, on one or two occasions, pop, article pops up.
Yeah.
Telling you it's Jesus's faith. So yeah, that's how I would play it.
Okay, yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, I knew about. I was actually going to ask about the Habakkuk thing, so that's perfect. And yeah, I didn't realize that. Like you said, that makes a lot of sense. That when he's not echoing, he does use the article. That's huge. So do you think that? I guess if we could touch just a little bit on the third view, that's sort of, I guess, like a newer view.
It isn't. It isn't.
Okay. Yeah. See, I'm not, like I said, not as like involved in this as whatnot. But yeah, so I guess there's like a third view that people are talking about where it's just like Christ's faith, and that seems to play a lot on like not having the articles. Or, and I guess I mentioned to John, yeah, there's like the faithfulness to Christ. I don't know. I listened to a podcast the other day with on script or whatever, and they were talking about the Christ faith view, and I wasn't sure if this is exactly what you were thinking.
I can explain that. Yeah. So my friends in the opposing side here, the objectivists, slip and slide a bit in what they think this genitive means, because they have to. Because on the one hand, they want it to be personal and stay personal. They want this to be trust in Christ. On the other hand, they're quite strongly committed to the idea that you have to believe certain things to be true. So it's more of a creedal faith. And what the third view has done is it's kind of shot itself in the foot, which I'm pleased about. And it's done this grammatical clarification and this idea that you're trusting in another figure or person or God, that kind of personal trust in, they have actually argued is not what Paul is talking about here, given the surrounding context, the cases, the prepositions, all this kind of stuff. We've got to take that off the table. And they think it's actually this third view, which is Christ faith, which is you believe in something and the content of the stuff that you believe is Christ. So it's like a creed. I believe, and what I believe is a kind of a stuff about Jesus. So it's what we would call more a genitive of content. And this is a helpful clarification because they're right about this. And this explains what the early church fathers were doing a lot of the time. By the time we get creeds, they tend to come to Paul and read these phrases in this way. They do. They go, oh, Paul's being creedal. He's telling us what we need to believe. We believe about Jesus, that he did this and did that and rose from the dead. We believe in the creed. The problem is that's a very dangerous thing to suggest about Paul himself, who writes at an incredibly early stage of the church. And to suggest that there are creeds in existence then is likely to be anachronistic. So you've got a lot of work to do to prove that creeds were actually in place. And Theresa Morgan has written a massive learned book, basically crapping all over this idea. And she's right. There aren't any creeds until at least the 2nd century, halfway through the 2nd century. You're 100 years after Paul. I'm perfectly happy to concede that people started reading it this way from about 150 onward, once they had creeds. But I'm interested also in what Paul did. And yeah, so I think when you take this anachronistic view, which is grammatically plausible, put it back in Paul's texts, you still have all the problems that we've already identified for the other view. How does your faith, the content of which is Christ, act to reveal the saving righteousness of God? Well, it can't. Creeds don't do that. How does your faith, the content of which is Jesus Christ, get promised and arrive in exactly the same way as the seed is promised and arrive. How do you solve that problem in Galatians 3? Well, you haven't. How do you solve the transition in Galatians 2:15 to 16 to 2:20 to 21 with Christ's faith? You haven't solved it. So all the local exegetical considerations are not solved by this reading. So I am a little amused by this recourse. I find it. I think the reason why I said a little unkindly that they've shot themselves in the foot is that if you go hard in on this third view, you've taken away one of the most important things that was in the favor of the objective view, which is the data from Abraham. Because everybody says Abraham trusts in God.
Yeah. And
these third view guys have just said, well, no, these two things don't fit together. They're not the same. And I'm like, thank you. Thanks for that. Because in the subjective reading, boom, Jesus' faithfulness, Abraham's faithfulness, God, Jesus' faithfulness to God fit together like hands in the glove. But I don't want to be unkind, but they don't seem to have figured this out yet. But they've created a very big problem for themselves. So we'll see how that plays out.
Okay, yeah, I guess that makes total sense too. Like, even if you can argue that there were creeds or whatnot, like there was a sort of Christian faith early on when Paul was writing, I think everyone's going to agree that Abraham wasn't a Christian. I think is pretty, at least seems safe to say for me.
Safe to say on that one, yeah. I'm with you. I'm with you, Ethan.
I don't have to be a theologian to get to that one. So yeah.
Exactly. I mean, and yeah, this is people dancing around trying to come up with grammatical reasons for not doing what the text is kind of pushing them to do, which is it's pushing back on their theology and saying rethink this. Your theology is a little off.
Awesome. So it seems pretty strong. I read getting started for this. Like one big thing I read was I guess Chris Tilling wrote the chapter, but you wrote some of it in the Beyond Old and New Perspectives book about this, and you seem a little more, I guess in this conversation, you seem a little more like dead set that this is like the only real reading that makes full sense of the whole thing. I don't know, maybe I like just reading is a little different than hearing someone talk or not, but it almost seemed like there's a little more, you were a little more open maybe to the objective view, and maybe not, maybe I just kind of read that wrong, but it sounds, would you agree that like there's really, if in your mind it's not so much of a debate, you don't see yourself kind of changing your mind or anything along those lines? This seems to be the only view that really makes sense of what Paul's trying to say.
Well, I don't want to say that we don't have faith. People get a little confused here. If you're kind of a subjectivist, you're never saying, oh, Jesus has faith, so you don't have any. In some ways, what you want to say is the opposite of that. You want to say, because you get this gift of faith from Christ, you get drawn into this kind of Christ-like faith. So our faith remains very, very important. It's just going to do different theological work. Mm-hmm. Instead of being something that you summon up for yourself to get into kind of a relationship with God, it's going to be a response within a relationship that God has already established. So you can think of it more like a marriage. You don't get married to someone because you've decided in advance you have enough faith. Well, it probably helps a bit. It's more something that you're in the marriage and you learn and practice faithfulness within that relationship. And this is an important part of how you relate to people. It's an important part of how we relate to God. If that makes sense, faith becomes a part of Christian ethics instead of functioning in what we would call Christian soteriology. It shifts out of its role. And that's very, very important. That's kind of crucial, because it means that God doesn't relate to us on the basis of a contract. God's not a contractual God. I'm worried that I've wandered a little bit off course. Oh, yes. Am I still confident? I tend to wander. It's John's job to kind of pull me back.
Yeah, I'm Doug's handler is why I'm here. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amongst other things, but I need you around more often. I've just had some very clever students working on this issue, this semester, and some books have come out, and my publishing was done a couple of years back. So these things have come out, and you kind of go and look at these books and go, oh shoot, maybe the whole debate's changed, maybe all my arguments don't work anymore. What I found was people on the other side of the debate failed pretty much to present those arguments correctly, and failed badly. So they did what's called set up a straw man. Oh, Campbell thinks this, or Martin thinks this, or Hayes thinks this, and they don't. We don't. We actually have a different, more powerful set of considerations. And because I know what those arguments are that people like Richard Hayes makes, I know that because they haven't been represented properly, they haven't been refuted. So once the opposite side of the debate is running around misrepresenting you, you know you've won the debate. You know it's over.
Yeah.
So I am quietly confident that this is the right reading. I'm not confident that scholars everywhere and preachers everywhere are going to sign on to it, because the sorts of theological agendas that you and I have been alluding to, I think will overwhelm the considerations rooted in the texts and the grammar. I'm not confident that the truth will out. But hey, this video is a little skirmish that we hopefully will win, and it'll move the needle on the dial. Maybe this is the start of something big, Ethan.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. No, that's
Can I
awesome.
ask a question
Yeah.
quick,
Go ahead.
Ethan? So Doug, earlier you alluded to the sort of importance of getting the right theological location for human faith, that it's not so much a soteriological category, it's actually in ethics, right? It's a fruit of the spirit, which is something that people forget. That's where it's located, is in the life of discipleship, and in the community. Can you talk a bit about the mind of Christ in relation to this faith stuff we've been talking about? This gets overlooked, I think, by a lot of people, is the significance of the mind of Christ, the mind of the Spirit, especially about faith, because it's so kind of weird, I think. Scholars don't really know what to do with it. So can you just talk a little bit about the mind of Christ?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if what you're alluding to here is Paul's understanding of kind of what happens to us as Jesus followers, as you say, the Holy Spirit is incredibly important. Incredibly important. The Holy Spirit literally joins you to the mind of Jesus, the mind of the Father. We all get connected together by this one Spirit. We drink the Spirit, we eat the Spirit, we're immersed in the Spirit. And one of the things that the Spirit does is as you say, it gives us this new mind. And we all know these texts, right? Mm-hmm. Romans 12:2, be recreated in the reconstitution of your mind, be transformed in the recreation of your mind, of your nous. The way you get reformed, reconstituted is through the presence of the Holy Spirit. And this presence of the Spirit giving you a new mind, new way of thinking, new way of behaving, new way of feeling. This is the thing that guarantees the resurrection of our bodies at the end of the age. If this is really what's going on for Paul, if this is what he cares about, if this is what makes sense of everything, it would follow all your thinking and all your believing and all your trusting and all your faithfulness will come from exactly the same place that all your obeying and all your loving and all your kind acting and all your patience and all your joy and all your peace comes from, which is from the Spirit. The Spirit who is transmitting to you the mind of Christ and forming you into the mind of Christ. So this is really the heart of the matter, and it's very Trinitarian. Ironically, this is creedal. This is what the creeds are saying. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit all, three in one, involving us in their communion. This is what Paul is trying to tell us. He is gesturing towards the creeds, but the creeds are not about you and me. We're not at the center of the creeds. God is at the center of the creeds, involving us. Yeah. Is that what you were thinking about, John?
Definitely. Yeah, and I think a big part of that too, which you alluded to, is the place of assurance. That faith gives us an assurance that we're actually bolted onto Christ, and that we're actually going to be resurrected, like Christ was resurrected too. So it's faith. A lot of times, for a lot of people, can create a certain amount of anxiety. Am I having enough faith? Am I believing hard enough? Right? Am I doing all the right things to do to have the most faith that I can? Whereas for Paul, it's something that actually gives you the assurance that you're good. you're good in this. Yep.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's really sad when we ask people to have faith and they have to kind of gin it up for themselves.
Yeah.
We're actually inviting people into a bit of a horror story.
Yeah.
Because as you say, self-reflective people look inwards and say, do I have enough faith? And they'll probably say no.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have doubts.
Yep.
Am I saved? Have I got enough faith? And we die in anxiety and trepidation and fear, when that's the opposite of what Paul is trying to say, which is, for goodness sake, have confidence. Stop worrying about yourselves. You're good. Go out and help some other people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, bad doctrine enslaves people. It's twisted. There's a level of deception in it, and it twists and breaks and enslaves people. Often turns them in on their own resources, whereas good theological positions lift you up out of yourself to celebrate and enjoy what God has done for you. You get a sense of lift from it. And the subjective reading, the idea that Jesus has walked faithfully where we couldn't, and summons us and gifts us with that faithfulness, that's something that lifts you.
Yeah. As a Saint Jeff McSwain would say, wake up and smell the coffee.
Yeah, wake up and smell the coffee. That's right.
The reality is all around you. You're in it. You're good.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, totally. It's totally like you said, the moving the faith to the ethics part of it totally makes perfect sense. And that seems to be like, you're right. It just like the more I hear you talk and think this through, I just don't understand why anybody sort of pushes back at all. Because I see why some people do, but I guess like in the circles I'm in, like Reformed and stuff, it just doesn't, like, that seems like what I heard when I heard the gospel was that, like, you don't believe in order to be saved, like you believe like we love because we were first loved by God. It's just, it seems so much more sense to me, and that's why I just really wanted to get this specific one out there, to people, because I think this is a really good sort of jumping off point for sure.
I think a stumbling block, Ethan, is folks don't know how to give an account of the works of law texts. So even though you can think like a Calvinist, when it comes to the works of law faith text, then you think like a Lutheran. And Calvin even did that himself. So you've got to know how to handle those texts, which is sort of a different conversation, but it's an equally important conversation because, cutting a really long story short, the church has been really, really happy to throw Messianic Jews and Jews under the bus and say that Paul was throwing Jews under the bus. And it's really very recently that we've realized this is a horrible, horrible mistake. We should never have said this, and we should never have learned to read these texts in a way that is kind of fundamentally anti-Jewish. And so there's a way out. There is a way out, which is realizing that Paul's not anti-Jewish. He's not dumping on Judaism. He's not dumping on all the Jews. He's got very specific people in mind whom he's attacking in these texts. It's not about, here's the Jewish religion, which sucks, And unless you realize it sucks, you're not going to become a Christian. You just do not want to be reading these texts in this way. And you don't have to. It's not a responsible way to read them historically. Again, it's an anachronism.
Yeah, I
But
guess.
that is, yeah.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I guess as you're saying this and stuff, you're right. Like, I feel like people they understand theology from like a Reformed perspective, but they read the text like from this Lutheran perspective. And I
Yeah.
really don't think those two things really mesh up. But not enough people, I guess, do the hard work of really really investigating the way they read the text and stuff. And they just like, I do think there's this conflict there or whatever that just doesn't get resolved, and that
there's a tension. There is a
Mhm.
tension, and if you've been taught that you have to live with this because this is what the gospel says, then you learn to live with it. But don't, get out, interpret that tension as an impetus, to more coherent work.
And to buy our book when it comes out.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of where I wanted to get. As we kind of wrap up, I think we really hit on a lot of good stuff. So if you kind of you got your work, and then you and John are putting together a new book that I think will help a lot of people. But yeah, I guess I'll end with one question that I've been asking a lot of people too. And then if you could kind of point, I'll make 2 points. If you could just kind of point people towards like where some books maybe they should look into that you recommend. If this sounds interesting, you realize maybe I was on one side, but I really like what they're saying. Maybe I want to understand this bigger picture, where they're coming from. And also too, I like to ask people like yourself, since I'm not as actually in academia and whatnot, when I know for myself, I have a tendency to I like what you're saying and this makes sense to me, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's true, right? Like it might, maybe, whatever. So if you could kind of a little bit of advice for someone like myself to kind of investigate these topics, because I think, just because I like it, it doesn't mean it's true. So how should I kind of think about this, and then if you could kind of point people to a few books or articles or whatnot where they could kind of understand this topic a little deeper, and maybe the surrounding topics as well. And I know it's kind of a mouthful, but
John, I think probably you're in a better position than me to make the recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, I've sent Ethan some resources on this already, and I mean, there's some great stuff. Thankfully, we have recordings of the Beyond Old and New Perspective conference, so you can see Chris kind of basically summarize what you're doing in Deliverance on Faith.
Yeah,
pretty concisely. He does a really, really good job, and he also offers sort of he gives sort of two of the main objections from the objective camp. I think he handles Matlock and Watson in that paper. So that's a good resource too. Is that video? I think it's on YouTube.
I think Apocalypse here is a good resource.
I have a video on faith. I do.
No, I really do. I think. Yeah. Well, I do. I think the whole thing.
Thanks.
People should attend to. Ethan, do you think maybe the most constructive way forward, and John, your experience of these matters will be invaluable at this moment, but my hunch is that rather than kind of banging away at the technical stuff all the time, going at it head on, sometimes what folk need is a deeper understanding of the possibility that they're exploring, the alternative possibility, which really goes back to God. What sort of God are we involved with? And it goes back to getting a deeper understanding of the Trinitarian God. And if you can get hold of that, and if that gets hold of you, the other things will kind of start to fall into place. So maybe some of the basic Trinitarian stuff is also helpful. I mean, I actually like the Shack.
Yeah.
I like Baxter Kruger's stuff on the Trinitarian God in terms of the Great Dance. I like all these Trinitarian resources a lot. And Jeff McSwain, we've mentioned. Jeff's stuff is terrific on this. So I would recommend reading deeper into that, starting to get into some of the fathers.
Yeah.
get into some of those conversations. And who else? And then the mother lode for me is the Torrances. So you can start to get into some of the Torrances' work. They're a kind of a network, a family of theologians. You've got James Torrance, JB, TF Torrance, Alan Torrance, and then behind them is Bart.
Yeah,
So
we actually did a review of, I forget which Torrance, but the Covenant and
JB.
Contract
JB.
essay in that same Old and New Testament book, or Old and New Perspectives.
You already
book.
know about JB. Good.
Yeah, a
good.
little bit. And I asked John which TF Torrance book to get for Christmas or whatever. So I think I'm getting the Space, Time, and Incarnation.
Resurrection.
Get
Space, Time, and Resurrection.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
get both of them.
Well, I'll get them both. If whichever one I did say or whatever, I'll just buy the other one on my own. But
I think TF is very good, and I think James is very good. I think Alan's stuff is difficult, but Alan James, he writes a lot of essays, very powerful essays. I've learned a huge amount from them. You know, the early Webster is very good too, probably before he took his turn towards Aquinas and simplicity. This is sort of out of left field too. I like Miroslav Volf's stuff, Exclusion and Embrace, and Grace. He's written a wonderful book on. Is it called Grace? It's like living with grace in the world. It's gift or something like that. Yeah, Miroslav Volf. Ethan, there's a surprisingly small number of people who really do this stuff. It's embarrassing.
Yeah,
but we're happy. We're a happy group.
Free of charge is the Wolf book.
Free of charge.
Yeah.
Living in a world stripped of grace.
Yeah, I mean, Fleming Rutledge is awesome. She's very helpful with a lot of theological stuff.
She's terrific.
Ethan knows a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
And like Bruce McCormack
really
is
enjoying this a ton. So
I think you're right, Doug, that like loading up on the good theological resources first in some ways, and it may not be as impactful for some people. They may really want the sort of exegetical nitty-gritty stuff up front, right? And you can give them that. You can go read Richard Hayes. You can go read your sort of more technical stuff.
Yeah, we got
But
plenty.
like, I think for a lot of people, especially when the presuppositions that you're bringing to the text and the theology that you're already presupposing isn't that great, correcting that stuff first and getting that stuff sort of healed by, the God revealed in Jesus Christ before going into that stuff, I think is important. So I think you're exactly right on that, Doug.
Yeah, if you really want to get into the text, I would also strongly recommend getting into Lou Martin. Yeah, he's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
He's
I had a list of books I asked for Christmas. One of them was T.F. Torrance. One of them is J. Lou Martin, the History and Theology and John's Gospel. Yeah.
Well, you need to get into the Paul stuff. The Paul stuff, he's written two. There's a commentary and then there's a collection of essays that I think you would resonate with, Ethan. Theological issues in the study of Paul, which is really terrific. And my colleague has written a lovely book on Paul. Susan Eastman's written a book called Paul and the Person. And what I like about that book is the way she opens up this alternative understanding of God as giving and relating to us and equipping us out of a relationship. It links up with a tremendous amount of neuroscience and work being done today on infant development, where all our identity is formed in relationship. And she does a lovely job of getting into that stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, I really appreciate how you mentioned, though, like, you're right, like, not necessarily the nitty-gritty technical stuff maybe isn't, if you're having trouble or whatever, is not necessarily the only thing you need to focus on. Really coming into a real relationship with God can really change your mind on these things, and then you realize. Yeah.
Get the good stuff.
I appreciate that.
And dial into what John is doing, because John is doing a great service connecting with a lot of these resources and putting them in an accessible place and in forms that are really graspable and accessible. So yeah, I think I think Apocalypse here is a great resource.
Thanks, man.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, I do too. I mean, that's John's a big reason why I'm interested in these things. Where like I got interested in theology, but really like meeting him really took it to the next level and really got me interested in like this.
Good.
I felt like it was a whole nother world or whatever. It wasn't just
the next
gospel
step is the Bart reading group. The next step for you, Ethan, is the Blood Covenant to read Bart's Dogmatics.
Yeah, I actually found like I got one I found at like a used bookstore or whatever, but I think I've read like one page of it, but
Well, start off and get your brothers and sisters who are
but
interested.
I did read this.
Swear the covenant. Swear the covenant once a week in the pub.
Okay.
20 pages together.
You'll be done in like 10, 15 years, or probably way more than
yeah,
that.
probably about 15.
All right. Well, yes, I really, really, really appreciate you coming on and talking about this. I think we hit on, we got into what I wanted to talk about, this Pistis Christou, but we also touched on a lot of other stuff that this was super helpful. I hope people enjoy this. And yeah, I really, really appreciate it. I don't know if you want to, like I said, John and Douglas are coming out with a new book that you should definitely check out. If you're watching my channel, I think their book that's coming out is kind of up a lot of people's alley. But like I said, Dr. Campbell has a number of books that'll be linked in the description. And yeah, so I don't know if you guys want to say anything, last words or not, but I really appreciate you coming on. And yeah,
Thanks, Ethan.
thank you for this.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's been fun.
Yes, for sure. Well, goodbye, everybody, and thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and do all that kind of stuff. I really appreciate it. But with that, we are out of here.